So I have a few questions here that I will do my best to answer. And then if anybody else has any other questions, you guys can head up to the microphone. I'll try to make sure we're keeping this to about 10-15 minutes here. So one of the questions was, are the books that I'm showing approved of by the school boards to be used, or are teachers just freely adding them to their own curriculum? So it's actually happening in a number of ways. First of all, those organizations are donating books to the schools. Oftentimes there are so many books donated, librarians and teachers aren't reading through everything, and so they're just being placed in the school libraries, or even sometimes in the classrooms. And so part of the issue of what we're trying to encourage people in your own district to do is to go figure out what books are in those libraries. And we do have information on our website. There's actually a whole page that we have called Concerning Books. And there's a website that you can go on to where you can look up, in most districts, some districts you have to log in with a password, but most districts you can go and actually look up specific books or books on a particular topic and see what are in the schools. Now, there are certainly activist teachers that have particular books that they like, and they are specifically getting those into their classrooms. But this is an issue that for anybody, even if you're not a parent, you are paying tax dollars to that school, and that is in part funding those books. And so that is one of the things that we do encourage people to do, is to go to the board members if you're finding that there are some of these books in your districts. Okay, so the next question is, how can we best help parents protect their children if they don't have a biblical perspective or aren't a Christian? Is the conversation any different? In a sense, no, the conversation is not any different, because when we have a normal kind of 45-minute presentation that we've given for the last year throughout New York. And I would say probably 95% of that presentation is nothing spiritual or religious. We simply go through what's happening, how it's happening, what are the harms of these issues, and then we do make sure that one of the harms that we touch on is a spiritual perspective. So you can have these conversations with people that are not Christians. You can show them how these things are harming their children. You can give them examples of ways that they can protect their children against this indoctrination, even if they are not a Christian. But certainly, I think that does provide a wonderful opportunity for you to talk about more deeper things with these individuals. Like we talked about, what is love? How do we have our identity? If it's not in God, then where is our identity coming from? Then can't we just make up who we are? So these can certainly lead to wonderful conversations. But for the most part, many people who aren't Christians still are recognizing that something's wrong and that we're harming children through these. So you can talk to them about these issues. Okay, so this one is talking about how a recent candidate for a board of education said that his reason was that I'm a Christian and I don't want 6-year-olds to be sexually indoctrinated. And he ended up coming in last for that election. So why are the communities rejecting that candidate, and what can we do differently? So I think we have to recognize that though our nation was founded as a Christian nation, we are no longer living in a society that follows Christian principles. So sometimes just calling yourself a Christian, you are automatically labeled as having a certain perspective. And that's one of the reasons why I talked about that idea that Jesus did not come into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. That's often a concept that people miss. They just think, you just believe that God's out to get anybody who doesn't follow what he does. And yet, Christ came to die for people because he loves us, and he wants to restore us and to have healthy relationships. So one of the things that, and I'm not in any way saying that you shouldn't, admit that you are a Christian, but I think we have to help people to think deeper about these issues and to see it from another perspective. So having a conversation as a board candidate, I would lead with a whole bunch of questions myself to people and say, if you have a child of this age, would you like a teacher to be teaching this if you don't believe that? Or would you like your child to get on puberty blockers? I would ask those types of questions that make it much more personal. And I would talk to them about those issues so that from a sense of humanity. We recognize, like, okay, wait a minute, I'm not okay with that, and even though you're a Christian, I can agree with that too. So it's probably just the approach. I'll say this too. I wholeheartedly am so thankful for the Christians who are out there engaging in these issues. But I have definitely been around Christians who, for example, one lady, she wrote a letter to, I think, a superintendent or something. Everything she said in the letter was true, but she used very emotionally charged language, and I was actually going to talk about this in the next session. But using emotionally charged language, I read that and I felt offended by it. I was like, man, if you were asking me these questions, I would not take the time to respond to you, and I agree with your perspective. So half the time, we just have to make sure how we're talking to individuals about this, that we show them that we are loving, we do care, we're coming from a logical perspective, we want to hear their perspective, we want to find a place to meet in the middle and see how we can protect children. So there's definitely ways to come about it. I don't know how this individual candidate came about their perspective, but that's at least what I would recommend. So this question is talking about how this individual has teens and young adults, and then what can they do now that their children are starting to believe some of these issues. A couple of things. I'll just reiterate what we talked about before, that idea of helping your children to critically think through these issues, helping them to think about the consequences of these issues. Help get some stories from detransitioners. These are the people who have transitioned to another gender, and then they realize that that's ultimately not satisfying, and they detransitioned back. Help them to listen to those stories, because that's really important that they can then identify, oh, I don't really want that to happen, to me, so maybe I shouldn't transition. So that's the first thing, is just helping your kids to think critically and get those resources and hear those stories. The second thing, which I have to think about for a second because I had it in my mind and now it's gone. I guess it must not have been that important, although I was saving it for the second point because it was the most important. All right, maybe I'll think of it later. Okay, at this point, does anybody have any more questions that they are interested in asking? If not, we will. Yes. If you want to come up to the microphone, maybe just so everybody can hear you. Thank you.
Nothing deep. I just missed a point of your earlier instruction where you said a percentage of college girls blank years ago were identifying as with gender identity issues, and now it's 1 in 20. What was that?
Yep.
First.
So in 2008, it was 1 in 2,000 female college students identified as transgender, and in 2021, it was 1 in 20 female college students. Yes.
You want me to bring the card?
Or you could ask it, whatever you prefer.
It's kind of long-winded.
That's okay. Okay, so this is talking specifically about homosexuality or transgenderism, and is this a genetic expression or a social construction? So one of the things that we have to understand is some of the stuff that we're talking about today, and especially once you get into kind of more of the sexual identities as well, none of this is new, okay? If you look back, way back in antiquity, if you look back in scriptures, it's very clear and evident that people have always had these concepts of, different sexual orientations or even their genders. One of the things that I had read and learned about is the idea that in some of these sexual practices, you would have men that would identify as female or male, depending on different things. So even that gender issue is not anything new. What we're actually seeing today is the resurgence of pagan ideas. So as a Christian nation, we were founded on particular principles, and now what we're seeing is because those principles are declining, We essentially have paganism coming back in. So none of this stuff is new. It's all stuff that if you saw ancient Rome and things like that, you would see characteristics of this. There's actually a woman, I was listening to her video. She's a PhD, I think at Yale, and she had done a dissertation on androgyny. And what she was saying is if you actually study histories and culture, the more free a culture begins to be, the more that they start accepting androgyny or gender changes or even all of these sexual identities, that's when you see the nations starting to decline. And we've seen it over history and history and history of different nations. So that being said, I think from a biblical perspective, what we're saying then is that things, even like homosexuality, all of this stuff, there is a seed of truth within it, okay? People who even identify as homosexuals, they are looking for love. And that's a good thing. God put that into human hearts to experience intimate, close relationships. So we don't want to devalue that in people. They are searching for those good things. The problem is that the way that they go about it is not the way that God has created humanity to go about it. Instead, they're doing it within their own will and their own design. And what ends up happening is there are spiritual and physical and emotional and social consequences then if we don't follow God's design. So hopefully that explains a little bit more then about just from a biblical perspective, understanding these things, realizing that Satan does that all the time. He uses that kernel of truth and then he just tries to twist it, okay? Remember, his main goal is to have you not be close and intimate with the Lord. He doesn't want us to be who God created us to be, okay? He essentially wants God's plan to fail. All right, let's see. Okay, that's about...
Okay, so
We'll make it quick. No, that's okay.
okay, so I was gonna see if I could re-trigger your mind. I'm the one who asked about the teenagers because I didn't realize when I put my teens in school, in public school, that by the time they got to where we are now, this stuff has like been like exponential in the past like 5 years or so, or 10 years. So I was wondering if that maybe would trigger the second part.
I'll have to think about that.
That's okay.
It was a really
You
good
can think about it.
point,
That's okay.
too.
The other question I wondered about was, I was really curious if this was like a common thing. And I know in Europe they do stuff like that. There's stuff going on too, similar stuff. But I wondered if like in cultures where it's more collectivist, so where it's not about me all the time, if this was as prominent.
So, yes, part of that would actually be like a study of how our society has changed from modernism to postmodernism. Okay. So we're in technically like the postmodern era, and that gets into a lot more of that like collective thinking and how it's a reflection of modernism. So that's like a much more deeper kind of like philosophical topic to get into, but certainly that is affecting where we are today, that if you're not a part of the group, you don't really matter. And that's an effect of postmodernism.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And hopefully I remember the other thing. Okay, one more question.
Hi, you're doing an awesome job. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Appreciate it. Not so much of a question, but last night, I'm a track coach. So last night I was at the state qualifiers and noticed that there was a team of young ladies that was doing very well in the 800 relay. So there's 4 participants in this running 800. And one team was ahead on the first leg. Second leg, they were still up. And then here comes the third leg and the change of the baton, the handoff, and it looks like a young man is running. And as he gets as the individual gets closer, then I can definitely identify that it was a young man that was indeed running in the women's 4x8 relay. He takes the baton and just darts off. I mean, the gap, not only did he pass, but the gap was something. That team ended up winning by 12 seconds. And I'm thinking to myself, my goodness, here we are. Now, it's already happened with swimming, as some of you already know. But I think as a church, we have to do better at getting ahead of what's happening. So this is starting as far as in the athletic world. And we have a responsibility to say, okay, the church, we're going to do something about it. How? Well, we can go to Section 5, as I know I am, and saying, hey, what are the rules for Section 5 as far as male, female running the different heats and saying that this is what they are. Now, at that time, you can't say, young man, you can't run because, hey, Section 5 did say that. What they decide to identify as is where they can go. So we can do something about that, which means we can also get ahead of it by getting to our lawmakers, individuals that are in government, and having a voice. So the church, we definitely need to do a better job at doing that.
Yes, thank you. And that's another one of those things, if you think about those 5 principles that we talked about, how it's an internally consistent view. If you think about how long women have worked to be able to have a voice and a place in society, and so quickly they are essentially taking the woman's place away. And so that's just really sad. And I understand that there are so many young girls that are experiencing that today, that they really just can't compete anymore because of what's being allowed.